Canadian couple Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka appeared to be love's young dream.
It was like, the Barbie and Ken couple. It seemed like the ideal relationship.
But they were far from a match made in heaven.
The level of evilness with both these people is so extreme. These people were animals.
What drove this seemingly clean-cut couple to their appalling crimes?
There was Carla Homolka raping, torturing right alongside her husband, and she seemed to be enjoying it.
Were Bernardo and Homolka born to kill? On the 29th of June, 1991, a discovery at Lake Gibson in Ontario would horrify the nation. It would be a sickening chapter in a story that had begun 2 weeks earlier with the disappearance of a 14-year-old schoolgirl.
Leslie Mahaffey was a typical teenage girl, beautiful girl in every respect. Went to school, came from a good family, had good values, and was sweet and kind and generous. A really, great kid who had her whole life in front of her.
On the 15th of June, Leslie had gone out with friends.
She was living at home with her mother and stepfather in Burlington, in a very nice middle-class neighborhood, and had been told that if you're out with your friends and you miss your curfew, you'll be locked out of the house. A little bit of tough love going on.
Leslie Mahaffey, a friend had died, and the very popular friend at the school, and so everybody was sort of mourning the death, and she got home a little late.
The door was locked. She realized that she had forgotten her key. On all other occasions where she has forgotten her key, fortunately rare, she would ring the doorbell, knock on the door, Mom and Dad would answer the door, and she'd have to account for, missing her curfew. For reasons that are rather inexplicable, she chose not to do that. Shortly thereafter, it became very clear that something was terribly wrong.
A search began for the missing schoolgirl, but her disappearance baffled detectives.
When Leslie Mahaffey disappeared from her home in Burlington, the news absolutely shocked. Not just, obviously, those living in the neighborhood, but Canadians in general.
14 days later, a canoeist on nearby Lake Gibson would discover the appalling answer to Leslie's whereabouts. But for one young couple, the 29th of June would be a far different experience. That very day, Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka were having a fairy tale wedding.
Carla Homolka had always thought of herself as a princess. She loved Disney characters, and she wanted to be a Disney princess, and she planned a wedding that certainly on its surface looked like something you could witness in Disneyland.
21-year-old Carla's Prince Charming was Paul Bernardo. 5 years her senior, but equally eager for a fantasy wedding.
There was a rented coach, the old-fashioned coach. There was pheasant under glass. There was a ball gown of a wedding dress that had the puffy princess sleeves.
To onlookers, it was the dream marriage of a dream couple.
It was like, the Barbie and Ken couple. It seemed like the ideal relationship.
But the true story of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka was no fairy tale. both harbored deep, dark secrets that, once revealed, would send shockwaves through civilized society.
Karla Homolka's childhood has always been presented to us as more than average, average plus. She grew up in a small town. She had a mother and father whose marriage stayed intact.
Dad made a living primarily going to flea markets and selling lamps. Mom was some sort of administrative assistant at the hospital in St. Catharines. They had 3 daughters.
They were well liked in the community. The Homolka family, it was like they had a swimming pool, so it was a gathering place for everybody. So she wasn't like, an only child or someone who didn't have a family. So she had a solid background.
She was the oldest girl, blonde, blue-eyed, pretty, vivacious. Spent a lot of time as a child playing Barbie dolls, but wasn't at all shy or weak.
She was naturally bright, but not diligent when it came to her studies. She was very typical of young girls from small towns.
But it appears pretty young Karla may not have been all sweetness and light.
As Karla grew up, and I guess became the rambunctious teenager that many of us did, she went from being the very popular, blonde, always had a date, or at least a couple of guys who wished they had a date with her, to a darker phase.
At times, Karla's behavior struck friends as odd.
Some of her friends called her bizarre because she was into the Ouija stuff and a little bit of the occult, and she seemed fascinated with death.
She wore black. She began to play in the area of, the psychicness, the seances, the dark side, the almost, I think, magical side.
One of her friends said that her pet had died, and Karla was determined to go to the backyard and dig up this body of this animal that they buried in the backyard. She had to see it. And finally they did it. Her friend didn't want to do it, but finally they did it. She just had this fascination with a dead pet.
The teenaged Homolka would go on to work at a local vet's, and it was whilst at a hotel attending a pet store conference in Toronto that she met the man of her dreams.
When she met Paul, it was like lust at first sight.
Taking coffee in the hotel lounge, 17-year-old Karla was approached by 23-year-old trainee accountant Paul Bernardo. There would be an instant and ultimately fatal attraction.
It was a chance meeting, but to a certain extent it was precisely what Karla Homolka wanted. She was part of a high school club that prized the idea of getting married to someone wealthy, someone slightly older, and getting a big diamond engagement ring. So this was already her mindset.
She could have had other guys, so she wasn't desperate, but she wanted him for some reason. I think something in the two of them just felt right. It resonated.
She was only 17, she was rather young, and Bernardo provided something for her that she was lacking. He came across as a strong individual, in control, and she became obsessed with him.
But there was far more to the ambitious young accountant than met the eye, and together Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka would become a deadly combination. In June 1991, While police searched for missing 14-year-old schoolgirl Leslie Mahaffey, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were enjoying a lavish, picture-perfect wedding. The seemingly dream couple had met 4 years earlier in the Toronto district of Scarborough. The year they met, the city would be rocked by an unprecedented series of violent rapes.
The sexual assaults were the most brutal that I'd ever seen in my career at that time, and I served for 31 years on the Toronto Police Service.
The mystery attacker would become known as the Scarborough Rapist.
There never was before and never was since such a string of attacks like that.
People were scared stiff for a very long time.
The terror would begin in 1987.
It was in the late spring, and we had two sexual assaults very close to one another. Both victims were attacked on their own property.
He attacked the women from behind, and they never really got a look at him at all.
He threatened the victims that he would do harm to them if they made any noise.
He scared them, like they were, literally afraid for their lives. If they screamed, he would kill them.
So although they're attacked on their own property with family inside, they weren't able to call for help.
The two assaults that spring were just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, the Scarborough Rapist would strike again and again, targeting lone women and teenagers and paralyzing the community.
Several women were taking buses home at, late at night, and if you were a car following, it was easy to spot if there was a lone woman on the bus.
Police flooded the area and created a dedicated task force, but the elusive rapist continued to strike.
They couldn't figure out where he was going to attack next. Everybody was on guard, and yet the rapes continued.
May to December 1987, 6 attacks.
Some of the police officers, when their shifts were over, they were still cruising the area trying to find this guy, and they just couldn't get him.
April and May 1988, 3 attacks.
As he continued, he escalated in his violence. And some of the violence towards these victims was unspeakable.
October to December 1988, 4 attacks.
He would do awful things like gather up stones and sticks and insert them into the woman who had just been raped.
June 89 to May 1990, 5 more attacks.
He took some of their belongings with them, which left them feeling more unsafe than they were in the first place.
In a couple of cases, the women were just getting the courage to get up. He would reemerge, throw them to the ground, and attack them all over again.
The damage that it did to those victims was unreal.
Law enforcement knew it was only a matter of time before the unthinkable happened.
When the FBI profilers actually were called in, they did say, if you don't get this guy, you can see from the way he's escalating, he will turn to murder. So there's no doubt that the fact that he wasn't getting arrested made him bolder.
All the while, the Scarborough Rapist was terrorizing the city. Karla Homolka was being wooed and captivated by her new beau, Paul Bernardo, a seemingly impressive and charming young man with good prospects.
He finished high school and went to university and eventually found his way into the Chartered Accountants program and worked for an accounting firm.
You look at him and you'd think that this guy is a professional, very, very confident, outgoing fellow who was very self-assured, didn't have any kind of doubts about his own ability.
Paul Bernardo was everything Karla Homolka had ever dreamed of, both as a child and as a teenager. He was older, tall, blonde. He was handsome. She called him her prince. And he had a car and he had a job. He ticked all her boxes.
But Homolka's Mr. Perfect was not all he seemed. Paul Bernardo was born in 1964, a Scarborough native.
He was troubled, it seems, from the very beginning.
His father's a voyeur, he was a peeping Tom. He seemed to be sexually inappropriate in a lot of ways.
His parents were sleeping in separate rooms, and it was just a very unsettled life that he had at home.
Despite the family turmoil, on the surface, the young Bernardo seemed well adjusted, joining the Boy Scouts and later becoming a summer camp counselor.
He was fairly athletic. He was a lifeguard when he was younger. He also took karate lessons, and very good looking. And he could get any girl he wanted, and he wasn't shy on ego at all.
When Bernardo was 16 years old, his mother dropped a bombshell. The man he believed to be his biological father was not. Paul Bernardo had been the result of an extramarital affair.
When Bernardo found out that he was a result of an extramarital relationship, he became rather angry. He became angry at his mother.
She had referred to him as a bastard child. And I know that they had screaming matches, there's no question about that at all. It wasn't a great family relationship.
I don't think he identified with his stepfather very much. I think he really hated him.
But there was one unhealthy interest the young Paul Bernardo had in common with his stepfather.
He was caught several times as a peeping Tom, trying to peer into the neighbors' windows. Parents often forbid their children from playing with him.
As he grew older, Bernardo's sexual needs became increasingly sordid. He began to humiliate and beat girlfriends and engage in sadistic sex. Most rejected him. That is, until he met Carla.
Carla's family life was pretty normal. There wasn't that much to say about it, but when she did meet Paul, she pretty quickly got into some of the deviance that he, the sexual deviance. She would write letters to him, saying, "Do what you want to me. I'll do anything and everything." So she resonated to his deviance very fast, which has to tell you this wasn't just, suddenly she changed. I'd have to say that there was already something there in her that he saw and triggered, that she was quite ready for somebody like him.
In 1990, after 3 years of terror for the city of Toronto, police got a break in their search for the Scarborough rapist. For each of his 17 known assaults, he'd been careful to make sure his victims were unable to describe him. But in May, the elusive rapist let his guard down.
He was brazen enough at that particular point to attack the female from the front. This was the first glimpse that we had, which helped us create a composite drawing to help us identify this particular individual.
After the composite picture was distributed, police received a tip-off that the image bore a striking resemblance to a 25-year-old local accountant, Paul Bernardo. Detective John Munro called Bernardo to the police station for questioning.
I'll never forget this as long as I live. He came into our office late in the afternoon. He was neat, clean. He wore a shirt and a tie. His hair was cut. He was very calm, cool, and collected. He looked like the all-Canadian boy. And I talked to him about different things, about any problems he'd had with women. He said he never had any. Did he have a girlfriend now? And he said, I do, my girlfriend's Karla Homolka. Of course, in November of 1990, the name Karla Homolka didn't mean anything to us.
Because he had this sweet boy look, this cherubic look to him, and charm, gregariousness, he was able, as any good psychopath can, to cover and charm people and make them believe that he's innocent.
Bernardo was one of 700 persons of interest that the task force were looking into. They'd already collected DNA samples from over 100 suspects.
I asked Bernardo to provide samples of his hair and saliva and blood, gave them up right away. By doing this is my opinion, he was trying to deflect any suspicion on himself by being so cooperative.
Testing of the samples would eventually prove Bernardo was indeed the Scarborough rapist. But tragically, not soon enough.
Now, at that time, the DNA was in its infant stages in terms of being a forensic investigative tool. So the police took the sample and it sat for 2 years on a shelf.
By 1990, Bernardo was spending lots of time with the Homolka family. But although he was now engaged to his willing girlfriend, Karla, Bernardo was not satisfied.
Paul had this thing for virgins, and Karla had boyfriends before Paul, and he liked women who'd, never had sex. They were virgins, and he was kind of annoyed.
For him, Karla's 15-year-old sister would provide the answer.
Karla and Tammy looked like twins, except for the age difference.
To Tammy, he was like, the big boyfriend. She sort of looked up to him, sort of idolized him, I guess. And with him, of course, all his thoughts were, sex. I want to have sex with her.
Paul Bernardo began pressuring Karla into arranging for him to take the virginity of her baby sister. And the most bizarre thing, and still impossible to comprehend, is that Karla did that.
6 months before their planned wedding, Karla Homolka decided to gift her younger sister's virginity to her boyfriend for Christmas.
The problem was that Karla was afraid that Tammy would tell.
Karla stole anesthetic from the vet's clinic where she worked.
And the idea was to put Tammy under and then have a sexual assault her. And that way they could have their threesome.
On the 29th of December 1990, with Karla's parents still in the house, they put their plan into action.
The family was all gathered and everybody went to bed except the three of them. They had Tammy drinking, got her drunk, and as she passed out, they basically raped her in every possible way.
The unconscious 15-year-old began to turn blue.
Tammy vomited and suffocated.
They turned her upside down because Homolka knew that from when she worked in the veterinary's office, but she actually died.
They quickly thought of a cover story, they called emergency, thought of a cover story, and that was accepted.
It was all passed off as an accidental death, which it wasn't, of course. Tammy was a gift that, to this day, to even talk about it is painful, because how do you, I'm a parent, sorry. How could somebody set up her own sister? How does somebody do that?
Tammy Homolka's unexpected death would not signal the end of Paul and Karla's deviant games. It would merely be the beginning of a sickening new chapter. For Christmas of 1990, Carla Homolka had promised to gift her sister's virginity to her fiancé, Paul Bernardo. But as they drugged and raped 15-year-old Tammy, she choked to death. And while the Homolka family grieved the loss of the young schoolgirl, Carla and Paul continued preparations for their dream June wedding.
They feigned a lot of remorse. Both Paul and Carla wept, Paul especially, about Tammy's death. But within a very short period of time, Carla was pressuring her parents to go ahead with the wedding. And she wrote to a friend how angry she was that her parents were taking so long, months, to get over Tammy's death because she wanted all of the attention back on her for her wedding.
Bernardo and Homolka's lavish wedding day went ahead as planned on the 29th of June 1991. But unbeknown to onlookers, as the happy couple smiled and posed for photographers, they were hiding another dark secret. They held the answer to the riddle of missing teenager Leslie Mahaffey. "14-year-old Leslie had mysteriously disappeared from outside her home 2 weeks earlier. On nearby Lake Gibson, a canoeist was about to discover her whereabouts. What he found would stun the nation.
It wasn't just a question of shock, it was a question of horror.
The water level was dropping down in Gibson Lake.
A fisherman found one, and then a passerby found another one.
Encased in cement, Leslie Mahaffey's dismembered body parts.
Some of the concrete wasn't solidified. It wasn't hardened, and it came apart, and one of the body parts drifted to the surface. And then they just dredged the lake, and they found out the rest of her remains.
Leslie's remains were found sawn up and encased in 8 concrete blocks. The people of Ontario now realized they had a maniac in their midst.
We're now dealing with someone who is demented in the extreme, a psychopath, a serial killer.
Because the Scarborough rapes had been going on, it just seemed like some new horror, that the crime was escalating in this small, quiet, perfect little town.
Leslie's fate had been sealed 2 weeks earlier. Before their wedding, Carla and Paul had moved into a rented house in St. Catharines.
St. Catharines is just, small, kind of Ontario community, which is accepted as being a very safe community. And obviously it wasn't.
Paul Bernardo's twisted urges for young girls had not abated.
He talked to Carla about it'd be nice to bring somebody home and just, I could have them at my leisure, for lack of a better expression. He wanted to be able to have somebody where he wasn't attacking them outside and running. He wanted to have them as a slave in his house.
And it would be 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey who paid the price for Bernardo's sick fantasies. On the night of the 15th of June, the schoolgirl had returned home late without her door key.
Unbeknownst to her, Paul Bernardo was on the prowl. He seemed like a normal person. Like all psychopaths, they have a charm to them, and they're remarkably successful in their manipulation. And he started up a conversation with her, and that resulted in her abduction and taken to the home in St. Catharines.
When he brought Leslie home, it was weird. Carla was sleeping at the time, and she got up, and he said, here's this woman I found. I think he'd put a hood over her head or something.
Carla Homolka became enraged apparently not because there was a young woman that he planned to rape in the house, but because Paul had shared their wedding glasses, the crystal flutes that you drink champagne out of it, and was sharing them with Leslie Mahaffey.
Over the next 36 hours, Paul Bernardo assaulted his victim repeatedly, constantly instructing her to say specific degrading phrases.
Bernardo engaged in scripting of his victims. He told his victims what to say. Tell me how great I am. Tell me I'm the king, and so on. He is sexually aroused by degrading and humiliating his victims in a very extreme way.
Apparently he had a difficult time, even with the rapes, keeping an erection. And the scripting helped because it was about humiliating these girls, saying things like, your boyfriend's not as good as I am, and much more vulgar things, which I won't repeat, but he wanted to degrade them as much as he possibly could and also elevate himself, make them say to him, what an amazing person he was.
After he'd had his way with her, Leslie's young life was taken.
He strangled her and then took the body in the basement, and Carla's parents came over for a Sunday dinner, and there's the body in the basement there.
This, to me, is one of the coldest things. She's going up and down into this cellar area getting food with the body lying right there.
The next day, Bernardo set up a plastic tent in the basement and plugged in a power saw.
He went and, hacked up the body, and he bought lots of bags of concrete from one of the local stores there and encased each body part in concrete and just threw them into driving over a little bridge and just threw them in.
Despite public horror and a high-profile police investigation, Bernardo and Homolka didn't stop.
After Leslie was held, tortured, killed, and then decapitated, they went looking for another young victim.
And this time, the husband and wife would go hunting together.
Kristen French was a remarkable, beautiful young girl, comes from a great family, was involved in school sports, had a tremendous sense of humor. She had her whole life in front of her.
She was a very careful young woman. After Leslie's death, she was always telling other students, like, don't talk to strangers if you see a stranger, blah, 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 don't stay away. She was always very careful.
On the 16th of April 1992, Bernardo and Homolka would commit their most brazen crime yet.
Kristen is walking back from school in the afternoon, broad daylight.
She was walking home down a very quiet residential street. She was in front of a church.
This time, the married couple would operate in tandem.
All of a sudden, a car comes up, and you see Carla Homolka, who was an attractive young woman.
Carla was out with a map, pretending she was lost.
That was the trap.
And Kristen, who's very careful, sees this young woman seemingly need help, so she went over to help her.
As Kristen leaned over the map, Carla grabbed her, Paul came from around, grabbed her, pushed her into the car, bent to the back seat, and they zoomed off to that same death house.
They kept her for 3 days, approximately, and videotaped it.
Just the brutality of it was gruesome. What can I say?
The fact that they videotaped the sadistic conduct is actually quite common. That's what sexual sadists do, and they do it because they want to manufacture their own pornography, where he's really the star actor.
During her ordeal, Kristen saw an opportunity to escape her tormentor.
Paul went out for food during the 3 days of captivity. He went out for food, and Kristen was quite bright. She said she wanted food from the farthest outlet in St. Catherine, so she knew Paul would be gone for a half hour. So basically, Carla was alone with Kristen French for like a half hour, and Kristen was pleading with her, and Carla wouldn't let her go. She knew that they had to kill her, and she knew that this poor girl was going to be dead in a matter of days or whatever. And she could have just picked up the phone and dialed 911. It would have saved her life. She didn't do it.
After 3 days of degrading and brutal sexual assault, Bernardo strangled Kristen. Together, he and Carla bathed and scrubbed the body, cut off all her hair, and dumped her beside a country lane.
By the time Kristen French's naked, shorn body was discovered in a ditch in Burlington, everybody was on high alert.
But all was no longer well for the once happily married couple. After the murder of Kristen French, Paul and Carla's relationship would begin to break down.
He started going downhill. He started living in his delusional world, and he started getting abusive with Carla. And he beat her up, and she basically left him.
The assault would spell the beginning of the end for the killers.
It wasn't until Carla Homolka went screaming to police about the fact that she'd been beaten up by Paul Bernardo that the case began to crack.
While Homolka pressed charges against her husband for assault, the DNA samples that the Scarborough Rape Task Force had taken more than 2 years before finally surfaced.
The long-awaited DNA results came back from the Scarborough rapes, and Bernardo was a match. And so they went to Carla, and she said, yeah, he confessed to me about the Scarborough rapes, and he was arrested after that.
When the officers went to speak with him, he was no longer the quiet, unnervous sort of individual. He just said, I'm not telling you guys jack.
Homolka, however, did talk. She admitted involvement in Bernardo's killings of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French and the death of her sister Tammy, but claimed that she'd been a battered wife and an unwilling accomplice. With little evidence against Bernardo for the murders, prosecutors felt they needed a witness to convict him.
The only way to put Paul Bernardo in prison was to believe Carla Homolka's story.
Homolka was offered a deal: testify against her husband and receive a total of just 12 years in prison. But before the trial began, a discovery was made that would show the self-proclaimed battered wife in a whole new light and horrify an entire nation. In 1993, Carla Homolka had admitted involvement in the killings of schoolgirls Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and her own sister Tammy. She'd claimed to be a battered wife and the unwilling accomplice of her husband Paul Bernardo. But before the trial of Bernardo began, a discovery was made that showed Carla in a whole new light. Hidden in the bathroom ceiling of the couple's St. Catherine's home was a collection of shocking home video cassettes.
The mini cassette tapes actually had writing on them in Carla's hand. Things like Kristen, Leslie, Paul, and me, with hearts and flowers on it, like little stickers.
What we all discovered is that there was Carla Homolka raping, torturing these young girls right alongside her husband, Paul, and she seemed to be enjoying it.
Attorney for the victims' families, Tim Danson, would be required to view the grim home movies.
It was a pretty awful thing to be part of, in the sense to see that level of pain and anguish and despair at unspeakable levels. It is not something that any human being should ever endure, and I'm talking about Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. I mean, it's that disturbing.
The collection also included footage of Bernardo and Homolka raping Carla's unconscious younger sister, as well as a sex tape recorded shortly after her sister's death, with Carla mimicking Tammy.
Within 3 weeks, we have Carla dressing in Tammy's clothing, trying to entice Paul without any remorse at all.
The public would speculate that Bernardo, as the Scarborough rapist, had not killed before he met Homolka, and question if she had been the motivating force for murder. What was certain, however, was that together Bernardo and Homolka were a deadly duo. But were they born killers, or had their upbringings made them monsters?
Nature versus nurture is a puzzling question in the case of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. Carla Homolka apparently had a really nice suburban childhood. Oldest of 3 children, pretty popular, had a little bit of the dark teenage years, but nothing unusual. And then becomes, if not the driving force behind sexual torture and murder, certainly a partner in crime, to despicable crimes, planned crimes. Paul Bernardo, on the other hand, has been described as probably mentally unwell from his early childhood. Now, of course, psychopathy can develop from a bad childhood, and we know that Bernardo was not treated well, that he was told at a very susceptible period that he was illegitimate.
I very strongly believe it's upbringing, that you have a troubled home life, and then it leads to certain feelings, and then he happened to meet somebody who facilitated those feelings. If he had met a woman who was horrified, you want to rape my sister? Like, if and by just some fluke, he happened to meet this woman who just facilitated everything. She just went along with his twisted, sick sexual fantasies.
He used Homolka for his own needs, and Homolka fed off Bernardo to satisfy her own needs. It was a symbiotic relationship. How these things developed is probably a combination of internal and environmental factors, but in my judgment, and the judgment of most people who have studied this in a serious way, that there's a significant neurobiological component to this, whether it's hormonal, genetic, electrical, chemical, exacerbated by a head injury, and plus psychosocial factors. There's a lot of things have to go wrong, which makes these crimes extraordinary.
So even if Bernardo and Homolka had never met, might each of them have been destined to become murderers?
There were people who said, well, if Carla had never met Paul, she would have never been a killer. I'm not sure that that's true. She probably wouldn't have been a killer, but she would have been a calculating, manipulative person. There's no doubt about that. Very narcissistic, very self-centered. So certainly, had another killer crossed her path, she wouldn't have hesitated to do whatever it took to be part of that person's life. Paul, I think, would have become a killer no matter what. The fact that he had a wife who allowed him to bring the victims home, just made it easier. But if he hadn't, he still would have killed.
Ultimately, the deal Carla made with the prosecution would stand. She would serve just 12 years for her part in the crimes, whilst Paul Bernardo will spend the rest of his life behind bars. One half of this deadly duo now walks the streets free.
One thing that was clear when you look at these videotapes is that the level of evilness and the level of psychopathy with both these people is so extreme that there is no ounce of being human. These people were animals.